Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to imagine a scenario where, a law you followed your entire life, like a massive pillar of a global system practiced by over 1 billion people today, was actually based on a fundamental misreading.
Yeah, that's a pretty intense premise to start with.
Right, but if you're familiar with traditional Islamic jurisprudence, you know the classical mechanic of zakat backwards and forwards. I mean, it's the mandated charitable giving.
Exactly. It's like the bedrock of religious charity.
Yeah, and you know the exact metrics, right? You've got the
Uh,
52 tolls of silver or the 7.5 tolls of gold. You hold on to that hoarded wealth for a full lunar year, and then,
You calculate exactly 2.5%.
right, 2.5% or a 40th part, and you distribute it to the poor. It's mathematically precise, it's universally recognized, but today we're doing a deep dive into a source text that just throws a massive wrench into that entire consensus.
Really massive wrench. We're looking at a fascinating, highly controversial lecture from April 1973 by the scholar Allama G.A. Parwez.
And his core thesis on Surah 9, verse 60 of the Quran is it's a striking claim. He says absolutely none of those mathematical metrics exist anywhere in the primary Quranic text.
No 2.5%, no weights of gold and silver, not even the one-year hoarding period. It's a sweeping structural critique.
Which is wild. So to be clear for the listener, we are not looking at this through the lens of, traditional religious dogma today.
No, not at all. Nor are we trying to validate or invalidate personal faith practices. We are just treating Parwez's 1973 lecture as what he intended it to be, a presentation of a radical socioeconomic blueprint.
Right, because his argument is that over the centuries, a comprehensive system of state-driven wealth distribution was just systematically hollowed out.
Hollowed out and replaced by this voluntary individual act of charity. Our mission today is to trace how he decodes the ancient linguistic roots that define the most vulnerable members of a society.
And whether you're into economics or linguistics or history or, honestly, if you just love a good paradigm shift, this is going to completely rethink how societies handle wealth and poverty.
Absolutely. And Parwez's methodology is so fascinating because he relies heavily on etymology. He goes straight to the foundational Arabic roots.
But before we get to the linguistics, let's look at his most provocative claim. If we throw out the math, the 2.5%, the silver weights, what is the functional replacement?
Right, because you can't just erase the foundational tax code of an entire civilization without a replacement.
Exactly. You need something structural in its place. So what is it?
Well, Parwez argues you don't replace it with another math formula. You replace it with a total paradigm shift regarding the purpose of the state itself.
Okay, so it starts with the word zakat.
Yes. So in traditional translations, it's usually rendered as charity or poor due.
Which implies, a wealthy person giving a fraction of their excess to help someone who's suffering.
Right, but Parwez points out that in its original linguistic root, zakat has nothing to do with giving away leftovers. The root meaning is actually growth or nourishment.
Growth. So it's not about just dropping coins in a box.
Not at all. In a societal context, he says the most accurate English equivalent is sustenance. It's the active process of providing all the resources a human needs to reach their maximum potential.
Wait, but sustenance as a societal mandate is just, it's impossibly broad.
It is huge.
If I give 2.5% of my savings to a food bank, I am technically providing sustenance to someone, right? For a few days at least.
Sure you are.
So how does changing the word to sustenance actually alter the obligation? Isn't it just a semantic thing?
According to Parwez, it's an entirely structural difference. Think of traditional charity like bailing water out of a sinking ship with a bucket.
Okay. So you're keeping it afloat for a bit.
Exactly. It mitigates the crisis for an hour. But Parwez argues that zakat, historically, was the mandate to pull the ship into dry dock, repair the hull, and make sure it never takes on water again.
Oh, wow. So it's a structural intervention, not just daily mitigation.
Right. And because it means providing total, comprehensive sustenance, Parwez concludes it's physically impossible for an individual to do it.
Yeah, one person giving a fraction of their savings can't build a hospital or guarantee universal education.
Exactly. So he posits that zakat inherently requires this concept called tamakun fil ars.
Tamakun fil ars. We need to break that down because the source text leans on that heavily to justify moving from individual charity to state responsibility.
Yeah, it translates roughly to the establishment of state power or, gain a firm, sovereign foothold in the earth.
So gaining statehood.
Right. Parwez argues the socioeconomic system in the Quran can only really operate when a society achieves statehood. And the purpose of that state isn't just to conquer things.
Right, it's not about imperial expansion.
No, the constitutional purpose of the state in this framework is to be the sole mechanism of zakat. The government takes absolute responsibility for the physical and intellectual growth of every citizen.
Okay, let me push back on that a little bit, because what you're describing sounds remarkably like a 20th century welfare state.
Oh, for sure. It sounds very modern.
Is Parwez just projecting, like, modern socialist economic models backward onto a 7th century tribal society? How does a 7th century state even operationalize total sustenance without modern banking?
That is exactly the critique historians would level at him, and it's a fair question. But Parwez anticipates this.
How so?
He argues that the principle is timeless, even if the mechanism scales with the era. He's not saying they had universal healthcare systems in the 7th century.
Right, no MRI machines in Medina.
Exactly. But he is saying the state treasury, the Beit al-Mal, was established with the core directive of total resource allocation, not imperial hoarding.
Okay, I see.
And he argues that reducing this to an individual paying 2.5% leaves the root causes of poverty totally untouched. It lets a wealthy elite hoard 97.5% of their stagnant capital and feel pious about a tiny tax.
While the underclass stays permanently dependent.
Yes, and Parwez says that is the exact antithesis of zakat. The goal is active growth elevating people so they don't need the funds anymore.
So, if the ultimate goal is a state-run system of total economic equilibrium, how do you build that from scratch?
It's not easy.
Because no society in history has ever transitioned from tribal capitalism to total resource distribution overnight. You'd instantly crash the economy.
Or face an immediate armed revolt from the merchant class, yeah.
And that is exactly why Parwez stresses this wasn't dropped out of the sky as a fully formed constitution.
Right, the source text says it was rolled out gradually. Over 23 years, I think.
Yes, a 23-year gradual rollout. He maps into 3 distinct stages, adapting to the political conditions of the early community.
Let's trace that chronological flow, because understanding that timeline is the only way. His argument about verse 60 makes sense later. Stage 1 takes place in Mecca, right?
Correct. So in the Meccan stage, they don't have a state. They lack that tamakun fil ars.
They're just a persecuted minority.
Exactly. They are operating in a hostile, unregulated, tribal capitalist environment. No treasury, no military. So the financial support is purely individual and voluntary. And Parwez emphasizes that the text specifically calls this early mutual aid Sadaqat, right?
Yes, Sadaqat, voluntary charity. Not the formalized system of Zakat. It was grassroots survival. If you had an extra date, you shared it.
Crisis management. But then things shift dramatically in stage 2. They migrate to Medina, and they finally achieve statehood.
Right. The Medina migration is the inflection point. Now they are a sovereign political entity, and they have to build a collective treasury from scratch.
Which is a monumental administrative task.
Huge. This is the transitional phase. They're moving away from voluntary aid into an organized system, collecting funds to build roads, defense forces, and a baseline of welfare.
But they're still in a mixed economy at this point, right? They're still building the infrastructure.
Exactly. The final economic rules haven't been codified yet. Which brings us to stage 3, the final stage.
And this is where the text introduces the bombshell. The community basically asks the leadership, okay, we have a state, what's the finalized tax rate?
How much of our wealth is the central system demanding? And the answer is found in Surah Baqarah, verse 219. It's the phrase, Qulil afduyu.
Qulil afduyu. And Parwez translates that as surplus, meaning give away everything that is surplus to your immediate needs.
That's the mandate. You keep what you legitimately require to maintain your life, your family, your means of production like your tools or business capital.
And the rest.
Everything else, the entirety of your surplus, flows into the state system to be redistributed for the society.
Okay, wait. Giving away all surplus sounds great in a utopian philosophy seminar. But practically, how does an economy function under that rule?
It's a massive friction point, absolutely.
Like if I'm a successful merchant in Medina and every ounce of grain I produce beyond my family's needs goes to the state, what's my incentive to work harder? How do you build capital?
Parwez addresses this by arguing the whole incentive structure of society has shifted. In tribal capitalism, your incentive to hoard is personal security.
Right. You stockpile gold because if there's a famine, you're on your own.
Exactly. Your hoard is your only safety net. But Parwez argues the Quloob directive only works if the state is the ultimate guarantor. The state becomes your savings account.
Ah, so you don't need a private hoard. because the collective surplus guarantees your survival if your crops fail.
Yes, you exchange private, stagnant security for collective, active security.
That makes logical sense, assuming perfect state efficiency and zero corruption, which is a pretty big assumption.
A very big assumption.
But the mathematical implication Parwez draws from this is wild. He points out that if the finalized law is Quloob, then hoarding wealth becomes definitionally impossible.
That is the cornerstone of his critique. Classical jurisprudence requires you to hoard wealth for a full lunar year before it's taxed. Parwez says this is a glaring contradiction.
Right. How can a system that forbids stagnation have a tax that relies on stagnant hoards?
If you follow Quloob, you never possess a hoard for a year. So the 2.5% tax on hoarded wealth is mathematically obsolete. You can't tax a hoard that legally shouldn't exist.
It's an incredible deduction. But let's look at the human element here, because stripping the wealthy of their private capital causes massive social upheaval.
Oh, absolutely. And Parwez acknowledges that. He uses a historical anecdote to show the sheer panic this caused among the early companions.
Because these were men who grew up in an environment where ruthlessly accumulating capital was the only measure of safety.
Right. And when the strict commands against hoarding were revealed, the psychological weight was terrifying. The lecture references Umar specifically.
Yeah, Umar was a hugely significant figure. And according to the text, he was so distressed by this that he confronted the Prophet.
He essentially asked, if we surrender all our surplus, what safety net do we have for our children? It's a perfectly rational anxiety from a capitalist perspective.
Parwez isn't criticizing Umar here, is he?
No, he's highlighting a universal sociological phenomenon. It shows the immense human resistance to radical wealth redistribution. It is so difficult for humans to give up private power for the collective good.
And this leads to what I think is the most profound meta-narrative in the whole deep dive. He tries to explain why the 2.5% rule exists today if it wasn't in the original text.
How a revolutionary command mutated into a comfortable tax write-off.
Right, and he brings in this entirely different narrative to explain it, the story of the Mirage.
Yeah, the traditional narrative of the prophet's night journey. In the classical telling, the prophet is initially commanded to establish 50 daily prayers.
And then on his way down, he runs into Moses.
Right, and Moses, knowing human frailty, says, your people can never sustain 50 prayers. Go back and negotiate.
So they negotiate it down, back and forth, until it's finally reduced to 5 daily prayers.
Now, Parwez isn't debating the theological literalism of that event. He's using the narrative structure as a metaphor for human domestication.
Domestication.
Yeah, history shows societies constantly trying to negotiate down heavy systemic responsibilities into easier, manageable rituals. A revolutionary ideology is exhausting.
So over generations, people water it down.
Exactly. Parwez argues the 2.5% charity rule is that exact same psychological mechanism. The original demand was Quloob surrender all surplus. But as the empire expanded,
as you get the Umayyads and Abbasids with vast estates and gold hoards, that demand becomes intolerable.
Right, so the jurists and the wealthy elite negotiated down the absolute demand. They codified it into a comfortable 2.5% tax on stagnant wealth.
Because paying 2.5% once a year is something a modern billionaire can do without actually changing their lifestyle or giving up systemic power.
It completely neutralizes the threat to the status quo. The revolutionary economic overhaul becomes a minor ritualistic tax. The system was domesticated.
That is a staggering sociological critique.
Yeah.
But it creates a massive logical paradox for Parwez, which he has to address.
And this brings us to the core text of the lecture, Surah 9, verse 60.
Right. The paradox is, if the final stage of this system demands the total eradication of poverty through state redistribution, why does verse 60 specifically list categories of people who get charity?
If the Quloob system is working, there shouldn't be any poor people left to codify.
Exactly. So how does he resolve that chronological paradox?
He argues that verse 60 does not represent the finalized Phase 3 post-scarcity state. He places it squarely back in Phase 2, the transitional Medina stage.
Oh, so the state is established, but the Quloob rule hasn't been implemented yet.
Right. They are still managing an economic crisis. The state is collecting funds, but it doesn't have the resources to provide absolute universal sustenance yet.
So verse 60 is an administrative directive for a state in transition.
Yes. It's instructing the Treasury on how to prioritize limited funds. It's an economic triage list, identifying who must be prioritized.
Let's get into the specifics of this taxonomy, because Parwez's linguistic analysis here is brilliant. He treats these categories as distinct socioeconomic diagnoses,
He does. And the very first category is the Fuqara.
which is almost always translated simply as the poor or the destitute.
But Parwez argues that flattening it to the poor misses an incredibly rich diagnostic term. He digs into the botanical root of the Arabic word fuqara.
The botanical analogy is so helpful here. He asks us to visualize a massive, ancient tree.
Right. An established tree has a deep, robust taproot. It can draw water from the subterranean water table even during a surface drought.
It has internal self-sufficiency.
Exactly. But the root of the word fuqara describes a specific, delicate type of freshly sprouted plant. Its roots are incredibly shallow.
They haven't grown deep enough to reach the reliable water below.
Right, so it's entirely dependent on surface conditions. If a gardener doesn't actively bring water and pour it directly over those roots, the plant dies.
It lacks the internal capacity to survive in a harsh environment. So how does Parwez map that shallow-rooted plant onto human society? Who are the Fuqara?
They represent individuals who lack the capacity to gather their own sustenance in a competitive market. They lack the deep roots of generational wealth, physical power, or social leverage.
So this would be the severely disabled, the elderly without support networks, orphans.
Or people who suffered a sudden catastrophe that wiped out their means of production. They are incapable of competing. The state, the gardener, must actively deliver resources to them.
And Parwez uses the story of Moses in Midian to perfectly illustrate this concept of lacking capacity, right?
It's a brilliant application. So Moses is fleeing Egypt. He arrives in Midian, exhausted, and goes to a communal well where shepherds are watering their flocks.
And he observes this stark disparity in resource access. He sees these strong, able-bodied male shepherds aggressively dominating the well.
Right. In the analogy, those men are the deep-rooted trees. They have the physical strength and social dominance to extract the resource in a highly competitive environment.
But standing off to the side, Moses notices two young women holding their sheep back.
Because they are physically incapable of competing with the aggressive men, they have to wait until the men leave to safely access the well.
They lack the physical power to secure the resource. So Moses steps in, uses his strength, navigates the crowd, and gets the water for their sheep.
And Parwez's critical observation is that in this specific microeconomy, those two women were the Fuqara.
Because they weren't inherently destitute, they owned sheep.
Exactly. They weren't lazy. The issue was that in that specific environment, they lacked the capacity to overcome the physical barrier to the resource.
They needed external intervention.
And Parwez argues that verse 60 commands the state to act as Moses did. Actively identify those who cannot compete and directly deliver the resources to them, bypassing the open market.
So that's the first diagnosis. The Fuqara lacking capacity. But the verse immediately lists the second category, the Masakin.
Right.
In standard translations, they just lump them together as synonyms for poor. But Parwez says the Quran doesn't use arbitrary synonyms in legal frameworks.
No, the root of Masakin is entirely distinct. It's derived from the concept of sukun.
Which usually translates to peace or stillness, right?
Yes, but applied to an economic state, sukun means a loss of motion, sudden stagnation, or being forcibly halted.
So a miskin, the singular form, is someone who actually has the capacity to move and generate wealth.
They have deep roots, but their forward progress has been forcibly frozen by an external systemic barrier. They aren't inherently helpless.
They're structurally blocked. And Parwez uses another famous narrative here, the story of Khidr and Moses from Surah At-Tawbah.
Right. Moses is traveling with Khidr to learn from him, but Khidr keeps doing things that look outwardly destructive, which infuriates Moses.
And one involves a perfectly functional boat owned by hardworking people. Khidr intentionally damages it, knocking out a plank.
Moses is appalled. He thinks it's vandalism against innocent laborers.
But Khidr explains the hidden socioeconomic dynamic. Down the river, there's a tyrant king confiscating all flawless boats for his oppressive fleet, with no compensation.
Right. If the boat stayed in perfect condition, the king's agents would have seized it, permanently destroying the workers' livelihood. By making it temporarily defective, Khidr saved them.
He enacted a temporary halt to save their means of production. So how does Parwez extract the definition of Masakin from that?
Parwez notes the Quran explicitly refers to those boat owners as Masakin. They weren't lacking skills or capital. They were fully capable.
But their economic viability was threatened by systemic tyranny.
Exactly. The Masakin are victims of oppressive regimes, predatory monopolies, crushing red tape things that halt their momentum.
So Applying this to a modern framework, the difference is incredibly sharp. The Fuqara are like a brilliant inventor who has a severe disability, zero seed money, and needs an unconditional grant just to survive.
Right.
But the Masakin are a fully functional, profitable small business that a corrupt local government shuts down with bogus zoning regulations just to help a massive multinational corporation take over.
That analogy captures the exact diagnostic difference. The Masakin have the capacity, but they are systemically blockaded.
And this changes the mandate of the state. It's not just throwing money at poverty, it's diagnosing the structural flaws.
For the Fuqara, you provide direct material support. But for the Masakin, handing them cash doesn't solve the problem. The state has to use its power to remove the systemic roadblocks.
Fight the tyrant kings confiscating the boats. Break up the monopolies.
Exactly. Reform the oppressive laws so those capable individuals can resume their economic momentum.
It's a diagnostic approach to welfare. Which brings us to the third and fourth categories. The Al-Amilina and the Waqf al-Quloob.
Let's touch on the Al-Amilina quickly, because it's the definitive proof for Parwez's statehood thesis. The term translates to administrators or civil workers.
The people employed to gather and distribute the funds. And Parwez uses this to completely refute the individualized charity model, right?
He does. He asks, if Zakat is just me handing 2.5% of my silver to my neighbor, why do I need a federally funded administrator for that?
Right. You don't need accountants for voluntary charity.
The fact that funds are explicitly allocated to pay the salaries of the Al-Amilina proves this is a highly organized state treasury.
It cements the Tamakun fil Ars argument. But the next category, Mu'allafat al-Quloob, is where Parwez targets a really uncomfortable historical interpretation.
Yes. The phrase translates to those whose hearts are to be reconciled or won over.
And historically, classical scholars interpreted this almost like political bribery.
The dominant traditional view is that state funds were legally earmarked to basically bribe tribal leaders, give them money to convert, or secure their loyalty.
Here's a bag of gold. Please align your politics with ours. It feels super transactional.
And contradictory to an ethical state, Parwez forcefully rejects that bribery interpretation. He grounds the verse in the brutal economic reality of 7th century Mecca and Medina.
Because the Quran was proposing a radical egalitarian order that appealed to the most marginalized people laborers, the destitute.
Right. They desperately wanted to migrate to Medina and join this new equitable system, but they couldn't just leave.
They were tethered to Mecca.
Trapped by predatory economics, they were bound to wealthy Meccan capitalists through massive unpayable debts.
The ancient equivalent of debt bondage.
Exactly. The elite used debt to ensure a captive labor force. If they tried to flee, the moneylenders would use tribal law to violently crush them.
They were held hostage by the financial system. So Parwez argues that Mu'allafat al-Quloob is an anti-exploitation mandate.
Yes, the state intervenes. It uses its centralized treasury to systematically pay off these oppressive, fabricated debts. A state-funded bailout for victims of predatory lending.
Wait, I have to push back. The early state in Medina was essentially in a cold war with the Meccan oligarchs. Why use precious state funds to pay off the oligarchs' predatory loans?
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
Why inject capital into the enemy's economy?
Exactly.
Parwez calls it a strategic ransom. The ultimate resource of any state is human capital. By paying off the debts, the state achieves two massive victories.
They extract their supporters from enemy territory.
Right, legally and peacefully. And second, they actively collapse the forced labor economy of their oppressors by removing the captive workforce.
So they're buying human freedom, not political loyalty.
Precisely. Once the debt is cleared, these individuals are legally emancipated. Their hearts can genuinely align with the new system because the threat of retaliation is gone.
It's an anti-exploitation fund, not a bribe. That completely shifts the moral weight of the category, which leads us to the final major category, Fir-Riqab.
Fir-Riqab, linguistically unambiguous. It translates literally to freeing the necks.
The ultimate eradication of slavery. And this is where Parwez's tone shifts in the lecture. He becomes much firmer, like a historical prosecutor.
He brings a severe indictment against centuries of imperial practice. He points out this irreconcilable contradiction between the Quran's explicit text and the actions of later Islamic dynasties.
Because the Quran, in verse 60, mandates that state funds must be used to purchase the freedom of enslaved people.
Fir-Riqab is a permanent, dedicated constitutional budget line for emancipation. But as empires expanded, they saw the economic benefits of free labor.
They built huge economies on the backs of enslaved people. completely ignoring the constitutional directive.
Instead, jurists aligned with the imperial courts constructed legal loopholes to maintain massive slave populations while claiming they adhered to the law.
And Parwez is aggressive here. He states categorically that nowhere in the Quranic text is there permission to enslave a free human being.
He completely invalidates the enslavement of prisoners of war, too. He cites Surah Muhammad, chapter 47, verse 4.
Which deals specifically with the aftermath of armed conflict, right?
Yes. It unequivocally states that once the conflict ends, prisoners of war must be dealt with in one of two ways. Option 1, unconditional release as an act of grace.
And option 2.
Freed in exchange for ransom or a prisoner exchange. Those are the only two legal options.
Free them for nothing or free them for ransom. But it never says you can keep them as permanent property.
Never. The concept of commodifying humans is entirely foreign to the Quranic economic system. The system was designed to actively dismantle and outlaw 7th century slavery.
And Parwez brings in this powerful reference to Surah Balad, chapter 90, where the Quran asks, what is the steep path?
What is the difficult ascent to true righteousness? And the text answers its own question immediately.
The very first step is freeing a neck, emancipation.
It places the abolition of human bondage as the highest, most urgent act of righteousness. It supersedes all other rituals.
This was just an incredibly radical vision for its time, and honestly, for our time too. When you synthesize these categories, you see a system diagnosing every root cause of vulnerability.
A comprehensive taxonomy of systemic oppression.
You've got the Fuqara who need unconditional sustenance, the Masakin who need systemic roadblocks dismantled, the Mu'allafat al-Quloob rescued from predatory debt, and the Fir-Riqab emancipated from physical slavery.
And the ultimate goal of the Quilla Aflaw rule, surrendering all surplus to the state, was for the state to deploy that capital to eliminate these categories entirely.
Right. Fund Fir-Riqab until slavery ceases to exist.
Yeah.
Fund Mu'allafat al-Quloob until debt bondage is eradicated. Nourish the Fuqara until true economic equilibrium is reached. So, to pull all of this together, we started with Zakat as a simple, individualized 2.5% tax. But through Parwez's analysis, we've uncovered a blueprint for a state-run system designed to guarantee total human sustenance.
And regardless of whether people agree with his precise translations, the sociological lesson is profound. He's warning us about the immense danger of losing a revolutionary spirit to comfortable history.
Domesticating a revolution into a ritual.
Exactly. When a powerful society negotiates down its heavy collective responsibilities into a token gesture, it loses the essence of what makes that society just.
It's remarkably easy for the ruling class to convince the public that justice just means tossing a few coins in a charity box once a year.
It leaves the structural inequalities completely unquestioned.
Absolutely. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Think about the global economy today. We have multi-billion-dollar charities, billionaires giving away fortunes, complex welfare state.
But are they actually working?
Right. Based on the true meaning of growth and sustenance, we have to ask, are our modern philanthropic systems designed to structurally end poverty? Or are they just functioning like that 2.5% rule?
Just comfortably managing the symptoms?
Keeping the shallow-rooted plants on perpetual life support just so the massive, deep-rooted trees can continue hoarding all the water undisturbed. It's definitely something to think about.
A vital question for anyone trying to understand the difference between mitigating suffering and actualizing justice.
Couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Parwez's radical blueprint. We will be back next time to unpack another fascinating paradigm shift.